Hey everyone, you've probably heard about lossless scaling and you have no idea how to use it or no idea what it even does. So this is going to be a really quick guide just to show you the basics of this application. Now, I do need to give a disclaimer that lossless scaling is not a miracle tool, but it is a program just like any other. It requires your computer's resources just like any other application. Therefore, the initial performance impact that you experience when using lossless scaling will depend on your hardware and on your in-game settings as well as the settings in lossless scaling. This program reinforces you to experiment a bit to get your ideal results. So if you cannot be bothered to do the bare minimum, then this program is most likely not for you. Last but not least, this program does not inject itself inside any of your programs, but instead it functions as a post-processing overlay that will hook similarly to OBS. This means that there are no risks of getting banned when using lossless scaling in any games, unless a developer has specified that they are not okay with this program or any other similar programs like OBS. So now let's address the settings. You have scaling mode and scaling type. For scaling mode, you will be met with automatic scaling as well as custom scaling. Automatic scaling will automatically adapt to the game's window and it will scale it dependent on aspect ratio or full screen. So if you select aspect ratio, then lossless scaling will preserve the ratio of the program, but you might be met with black bars if the aspect ratio is mismatching. Alternatively, if you select full screen, then lossless scaling will stretch the program to fill your screen. And now to address custom scaling, you will be met with scale factor. Basically, this allows you to fine-tune the resolution that you will be upscaling. If you leave the scale factor at 1, it's as if you're still running at native. If you're running it at 1.3, it's as if you're running it at ultra quality. 1.5 would be quality, 1.7 would be balanced, and 2 would be as if you're running performance mode. One thing that you need to be aware of is resize before scaling. So if you don't resize before scaling, then all that lossless scaling is going to do is just zoom in on your screen, and that's pretty much it. If you allow it to resize before scaling, then it will automatically capture your application and just resize it based on this factor and then upscale it to your native resolution. Now, to actually upscale your game, you can pick one of the many upscalers that are available to you. Generally, for modern 3D games, we would either use AMD FSR or we would use LS1. And LS1 is the proprietary upscaler that's made by the developer of lossless scaling. Now, LS1 does introduce a little bit more sharpening compared to FSR, but I suggest that you guys try all of these out and just see which one works best for you. Also, I do wish to add that if you're planning to play on any pixel art games, you can choose integer scaling or XBR, and this also applies for any emulators or any like retro games. So just go through all of these settings, see which one works best for you. After all, there are different monitor types, sizes, pixel densities, all of those play into account. So just pick the one that gives you the best performance and the most eye candy, you could say. Now, just to show you how to upscale the game, for these settings, I'll leave it on auto at full screen. I'll use LS1, but I will lower the sharpness down. There will be no frame generation whatsoever. All you need to do is open up the game, do your preset keybind. I'm just going to change my scene and you will see that the game is upscaled to 1440p. Now, keep in mind that because the window was so small, the result is not going to look as sharp at all. Now, alternatively, if you wanted to upscale based on aspect ratio, what would happen is when you go to upscale, and I'm going to change my scene again, you would see the black bars on the side, as we mentioned previously. Now, what you can also do is if you go to custom mode and let's say you wish to have the game on borderless full screen, in this case it's just windowed. Let's say I want to have quality preset. I would have resize before scaling enabled, scaling factor is 1.3, and I would just upscale it. Now you can see the black bars which showed me what the game is resized to initially, but this is how it would look like once you actually upscale it. Now let's move to frame generation, which is why most of you clicked on this video. You will be met with two options, LSFG 1.1 or LSFG 2.3. 1.1 is the first iteration of frame generation that we had. However, keep in mind that it's a very bare bones although it is the easiest one to run. So if you're having any issues with LSFG 2.3, you can always roll back to 1.1, see if that works any better, but keep in mind you might be met with a little bit more like smearing, but it just really depends on the game that you're playing. 2.3 is where you have the option to use 2x, 3x, or 4x mode, and the option to use performance mode, which would basically alleviate some GPU usage so that you can actually generate more frames. Now, I do need to put it out there that ideally we use frame generation to max out the refresh rate of our monitor. So for example, if you have a 120 hertz monitor, you can basically do 2x mode, cap the game at 60 FPS, that will give you the most consistent results. If you have it at 240 hertz, then you can do 3x if you want to play at 180, or you can do 4x if you want to go up to 240. Now, keep in mind, you're generating more frames at 4x, so sometimes you may need to pop performance mode on, but again, that just depends on the game and how much it uses your GPU. To show you the importance of giving lossless scaling enough GPU headroom, I do have Minecraft open with shaders. Now, I want you to pay attention at my GPU's percentage and also my frames. As I'm looking in the sky, I'm getting around 48% and around 120 frames. As I start to max out my GPU, I'm getting around 109 frames. It's just a 10 FPS deduction. Now, if I'm to run the frame generator, I'm just going to change my scene really quickly. You can see that my GPU percentage pretty much doubled, although my frames are the same. But if I were to look down now, my FPS will heavily suffer. As mentioned in the beginning of the video, lossless scaling will use your resources, and that's why you saw my performance dropping down when I had frame generation enabled and when I also did not give my GPU any headroom. So LS had to make it on its own. One additional thing I wish to add is that usually we wouldn't frame gen from 15 FPS up to 60 or from 30 FPS up to 120. Although you can do that, the results are not going to be pretty. It's just one of those cases where you play stupid games and you're going to win stupid prizes. So don't hold us accountable for the results that you'll receive. Now, to go over cursor settings, you have clipping your cursor, which will make sure that your mouse does not leave the application that you're upscaling. You have adjust cursor speed, which will basically mess with the sensitivity of your mouse. This is not really recommended for first-person shooters as it can mess with your aim sensitivity. Hiding the cursor is very self-explanatory, and scaling the cursor is also very self-explanatory. Now to move to rendering. First, you'll be met with sync mode. Now, as it pretty much explains, if you have your sync mode on off, this will allow tearing, and for NVIDIA GPUs, this basically allows us to generate more frames, and this is frame generated frames that would go above our refresh rate. If you do this, again, you could see some tearing, but you will have the lowest input latency. Instead, if you set it on default or VSync, it's basically going to cap out at your monitor's refresh rate. Having VSync at half, third, or quarter, this is only going to apply onto the output that lossless scaling is giving you. For example, if I'm running a 240 Hz screen and I use 3x mode and I'm generating on 60 FPS, I would be getting 180 frame generated frames. If I put this VSync down to, let's say, 1/2, then that would half it to 120 frames. The output that I'll be receiving is 120 frames even though 3x is enabled. But again, that's just an example. I'm not actually telling you to do that, as the result would be pretty bad. Anyways, moving on to max frame latency. Ideally for NVIDIA GPUs, if you want the lowest latency, we would have this at 1, and so far it's been tested that for AMD GPUs, you would either want maybe 2 or 3. That would give you like the most stable results. But what this does is basically feed more frames into lossless scaling first before you can actually see the final result. This will basically increase like the quality of the frame generation, but the input latency will jump up a bit. Now, if you do happen to have an HDR monitor, you can turn on HDR, but keep in mind it will pretty much double your VRAM and consume a little bit more GPU. Also, we do have G-Sync support, albeit it's a little bit experimental, but just make sure you turn on adaptive sync or just G-Sync on your monitor, and also make sure you turn it on from NVIDIA's control panel. Draw FPS pretty much shows you the real frames and the frame generated frames in game. It's up to you if you wish to turn it on or off, but it's a nice indicator that lossless scaling is actually running. Moving on to capture settings, you will have three capture APIs. DXGI will basically only capture any new frames, and this works well with most modern games. It will allow you not to lock your FPS if you're that lazy, but keep in mind that it will maybe fluctuate with your frame times, as lossless scaling will need to make headroom as you're basically playing through the game, so it will jump around. WGC will be displaying frames based on what Windows is reporting, so this strictly means that you do want to cap your FPS to a very consistent amount, otherwise your frame times will actually be kind of bad and it will become unplayable. And if you happen to be playing like a really ancient game back in like 2006 or even older, GDI might need to be used if the other two modes are not basically working. Moving on to GPU and display, basically, as I have a single GPU, my option would be auto, but if you happen to be playing on a laptop, you will be able to see your integrated GPU as well as your dedicated GPU. This also applies for people that have desktop computers with two GPUs. They can basically choose one GPU to be used for lossless scaling, while their more powerful one would actually be used to render the game. This can basically help you mitigate almost all performance impact that frame generation would give you. But again, buying a whole GPU for lossless scaling is not for everyone. Just if you're curious, you can play around with it. Output display. Basically, if I'm rendering a game on my 1080p monitor, I can set the output to go to my 1440p monitor. Yes, I will see the game on both screens, but my 1440p monitor will be showing me what's actually happening with all of the lossless scaling settings applied. Crop input is something that you would use, for example, if you're playing a game that doesn't have a borderless mode and just has like a bar on top here. You can basically crop 100 pixels and it will just remove 100 pixels from the top. It will stretch it a bit, but that's what you can do to basically get rid of these buttons here. Moving on to behavior, you have multi-display mode. Now, you can technically keep this feature on if you don't want lossless scaling to lose focus on the application that you're scaling. You don't need to necessarily have a second monitor, but it can be nice and convenient in case you don't want to constantly rescale once you tap back in. Moving on to legacy, we only have windowed mode here, but this is very obsolete. If some program doesn't want to work in windowed mode, you can try to turn this feature and basically see if that fixes it for you. Now that you know what all settings do, let's say you want to make a preset for a game. You can very easily do that by clicking on add on the left, and here you can, for example, name a preset named Cyberpunk. I'm just going to use that as an example. The filter refers to the location of the game executable. So you would go to browse, you would find where your game is installed, and you would just put the executable here. Now, if you wish to auto scale, this means that after, for example, 10 seconds of lossless scaling detecting Cyberpunk, it will automatically do the scaling based on the settings that you have, or you can still manually scale it yourself. Now, when you make this profile, you can adjust the settings just for this profile. So for example, if I turn all of these on, I go back to default, these are not active. And this means that if you have this filter enabled and you change any settings in default, if lossless scaling is detecting that you have a filter and that the game is running, it will automatically switch to this filter. Any changes you want to do to a game that's running, you must make sure that you're doing it on its preset. That's again if you choose to use presets. And if you wish to upscale a bit easier, you can just have a scale hotkey that you can always change here. Additionally, you can start as administrator. This is just so you make sure you can hook onto games that you're also starting as administrator. But do keep in mind that when it comes to auto scaling, you might have some issues with certain games that have like an easy anti-cheat. There also happens to be other use case scenarios for the frame generation, such as, for example, in heavy titles like Cyberpunk, if you wish to play with path tracing, ray reconstruction, generally like maxed out settings, but you don't want your graphics card to get like really hot, you can use it and potentially shave off like 60 watts of your GPU being used, as well as some percentage sometimes as well. Now, this will give you playable results, and what you're seeing right now is the actual lossless scaling output. Yes, you may see like a little bit of smearing, but that's just because I'm recording right now and my base FPS actually dropped. Very interestingly enough, you can also pretty much play remote play titles if you happen to have a PS4 or a PS5, and you can basically frame gen them and get higher refresh rate. Now, keep in mind that this will depend on the game that you're playing. whether it's in performance mode or graphics fidelity mode, but this is also applicable for any capture cards that allow you to have, for example, a preview mode. But yeah, this is Final Fantasy 16. You can see in the top left my frame rate. And for me, it's at 120, but you guys will see maybe like stable 60. And because it is a controller title, you're not gonna feel the input delay from like the frame generation nearly at all. It feels just as if I'm playing in front of my TV. And that's pretty much how you would use lossless scaling. Now, there are many more possibilities and use case scenarios for this program. For example, you can use it for normal multimedia content like YouTube or any live streaming services like Twitch, Amazon, Netflix, etc. You could also pair it with reshade for any spatial filters or anti-aliasing, or you could even use Special K, although that's a bit of a recent discovery, so your mileage may vary. I can imagine that some of you will inevitably run into some issues and you will have questions, maybe many questions. For that reason, I urge you to join the Lossless Scaling Discord server so that you can open a thread, we can look into things for you, or if you feel more comfortable, you can visit the Steam forums or the subreddit of Lossless Scaling, whichever one you prefer.